Dear esteemed audience, power doesn't always collapse with explosions. Sometimes it drowns in its own stillness. For decades, Russia's grand empire of oil had moved like a beast that could never be tamed, unstoppable, proud and hungry. Every drop of fuel that left its ports carried not just wealth, but a whisper of power. The name that once made nations pause in meetings, the brand that turned ministers into merchants, was Volkov Energy Group ***. To the Kremlin, Volkov was more than a corporation. It was an artery, and through that artery flowed the lifeblood of ambition. But one cold morning, that pulse vanished. Without a single bomb dropped or bullet fired, the entire machine froze. Tankers that once surged across oceans now stood unmoving in the waters near St. Petersburg. Not one of them advanced, not one dared. The sound of their engines had been replaced by a kind of heavy quiet that pressed against the skin. From afar, they still looked magnificent, colossal steel beasts resting on the sea, but beneath the surface, panic had begun to boil. Inside Volkov's headquarters, executives who once barked orders now whispered. Screens flickered with red warnings. The empire's rhythm, the schedules, the shipments, the calls from foreign buyers had broken without warning. The company's most loyal captains, veterans of the trade, waited offshore without instruction, their ships loaded with oil that no one could buy, sell, or even touch. It wasn't nature that stopped them. It wasn't sabotage. It was something far more precise, far more devastating. Sanctions on October 22nd, 2025 the United States delivered a strike unlike any missile. A few lines of policy, a few signatures from Washington, and an empire built on oil began to sink under the weight of its own reputation. Overnight, Volkov Energy lost everything that made global trade possible: its insurance, its partners, its permissions. Tankers became orphans in international waters. No port dared to welcome them. No broker wanted their cargo. No insurer would touch their name. The Western world had drawn an invisible circle around Russia's most profitable limb and tightened it with a lawyer's precision. The damage wasn't loud. It was quiet, suffocating, merciless. By dawn the next day, panic moved faster than the markets. Every call from St. Petersburg to Moscow began with the same question. Can we still move? The answer was the same: no. For years, the Kremlin had turned the Baltic into a bridge between its ambitions and the world. The tankers sailing from Primorsk and Ust-Luga carried more than oil. They carried the illusion that Russia was untouchable, that it could always find another buyer, another route, another loophole. But the world had changed its tone. The loopholes had closed. The gray zones that once sheltered Volkov's secret fleet, those nameless tankers hiding behind foreign flags, were now traps of their own making. And so they waited. 30 massive ships, filled with millions of barrels of oil, anchored in helpless formation. Each one cost Russia millions of dollars a day in lost revenue. Each one carried the scent of desperation. From Moscow's boardrooms to the narrow corridors of Volkov's control center, the message was clear. The empire had stalled. The fall was so swift it barely seemed real. The same executives who once mocked Western sanctions now watched their balance sheets bleed dry. The same oligarchs who boasted of untraceable offshore accounts were now unreachable themselves. Their phones went unanswered, their assets were frozen, their confidence dissolved. And behind it all, the one city that had always been Russia's proudest symbol, St. Petersburg, Peter the Great's window to the west, had become its own prison. The same waters that once opened doors to Europe now held Russia hostage. The ships stood motionless, like artifacts of arrogance. Every nation has a sound when it breaks. For Russia, it was not gunfire. It was the heavy, endless quiet of ships that could not move. In those still waters, power lost its rhythm. The oil that had once fueled armies, funded propaganda, and filled palaces now sat trapped in barrels under the Baltic sky. The beast that once roared with dominance now gasped for air, unable to breathe through the noose of its own creation, and far away the world watched. Economists called it a financial standoff. Analysts called it strategic containment. But those who lived it, those whose hands built the empire, whose ships carried its pride, knew the truth. This wasn't an economic crisis, it was an awakening. The empire that believed nothing could stop it had finally been caught in its own reflection. Dear esteemed audience, power doesn't always collapse with explosions. Sometimes it drowns in its own stillness. For decades, Russia's grand empire of oil had moved like a beast that could never be tamed, unstoppable, proud, and hungry. Every drop of fuel that left its ports carried not just wealth, but a whisper of power. The name that once made nations pause in meetings, the brand that turned ministers into merchants, was Volkov Energy Group ***. To the Kremlin, Volkov was more than a corporation, it was an artery, and through that artery flowed the lifeblood of ambition. But one cold morning, that pulse vanished. Without a single bomb dropped or bullet fired, the entire machine froze. Tankers that once surged across oceans now stood unmoving in the waters near St. Petersburg. Not one of them advanced, not one dared. The sound of their engines had been replaced by a kind of heavy quiet that pressed against the skin. From afar, they still looked magnificent, colossal steel beasts resting on the sea, but beneath the surface, panic had begun to boil. Inside Volkov's headquarters, executives who once barked orders now whispered. Screens flickered with red warnings. The empire's rhythm, the schedules, the shipments, the calls from foreign buyers had broken without warning. The company's most loyal captains, veterans of the trade, waited offshore without instruction, their ships loaded with oil that no one could buy, sell, or even touch. It wasn't nature that stopped them. It wasn't sabotage. It was something far more precise, far more devastating. ***, sanctions, on October 22nd, 2025 the United States delivered a strike unlike any missile. A few lines of policy, a few signatures from Washington, and an empire built on oil began to sink under the weight of its own reputation. Overnight, Volkov Energy lost everything that made global trade possible. Its insurance, its partners, its permissions. Tankers became orphans in international waters. No port dared to welcome them. No broker wanted their cargo. No insurer would touch their name. The Western world had drawn an invisible circle around Russia's most profitable limb and tightened it with a lawyer's precision. The damage wasn't loud. It was quiet, suffocating, merciless. By dawn the next day, panic moved faster than the markets. Every call from St. Petersburg to Moscow began with the same question, can we still move? The answer was the same, no. For years, the Kremlin had turned the Baltic into a bridge between its ambitions and the world. The tankers sailing from Primorsk and Ust-Luga carried more than oil. They carried the illusion that Russia was untouchable, that it could always find another buyer, another route, another loophole. But the world had changed its tone. The loopholes had closed. The gray zones that once sheltered Volkov's secret fleet, those nameless tankers hiding behind foreign flags, were now traps of their own making. And so they waited. 30 massive ships, filled with millions of barrels of oil, anchored in helpless formation. Each one cost Russia millions of dollars a day in lost revenue. Each one carried the scent of desperation. From Moscow's boardrooms to the narrow corridors of Volkov's control center, the message was clear. The empire had stalled. The fall was so swift it barely seemed real. The same executives who once mocked Western sanctions now watched their balance sheets bleed dry. The same oligarchs who boasted of untraceable offshore accounts were now unreachable themselves. Their phones went unanswered, their assets were frozen, their confidence dissolved. And behind it all, the one city that had always been Russia's proudest symbol, St. Petersburg, Peter the Great's window to the west, had become its own prison. The same waters that once opened doors to Europe now held Russia hostage. The ships stood motionless, like artifacts of arrogance. Every nation has a sound when it breaks. For Russia, it was not gunfire. It was the heavy, endless quiet of ships that could not move. In those still waters, power lost its rhythm. The oil that had once fueled armies, funded propaganda, and filled palaces now sat trapped in barrels under the Baltic sky. The beast that once roared with dominance now gasped for air, unable to breathe through the noose of its own creation. And far away, the world watched. Economists called it a financial standoff. Analysts called it strategic containment. But those who lived it, those whose hands built the empire, whose ships carried its pride, knew the truth. This wasn't an economic crisis. It was an awakening. The empire that believed nothing could stop it had finally been caught in its own reflection. It began with a rumor that spread faster than truth. Russia's phantom fleet was no longer untouchable. For years, the Kremlin's invisible navy had roamed the seas like ghosts, ships with fake names, hidden ownership, and questionable origins. They were the empire's loophole, its way of defying the world's economic laws. Each one carried oil that financed wars, propaganda, and power. They operated beyond maps, beyond morals, vessels of deception born from arrogance. But every secret has an expiration date, and when the mask cracks, it never breaks quietly. The fall of the Phantom Fleet started not with explosions, but with exposure. A single report from Western intelligence revealed what Moscow had always denied, that these ships weren't traders at all. They were weapons disguised as merchants, floating Trojan horses, their cargo holds concealing modular drone systems. Containers that looked ordinary from afar could open to release swarms of kamikaze drones programmed to vanish after impact. At first, the Kremlin laughed off the claims. Propaganda, they called it. But laughter turned to rage when the attacks began. In late September, Copenhagen's airport was brought to a standstill. Dozens of drones, small, cheap, and impossible to track, appeared out of nowhere and hovered above the runways. Flights froze mid-air. Pilots circled in panic. Air controllers shouted coordinates through static. For hours, one of Europe's safest cities was paralyzed by a threat so small it fit in the back of a truck. And when Western intelligence traced the drone's trajectory, it didn't lead to a known military base. It led to a tanker anchored in the Baltic Sea, a vessel officially listed as part of Russia's shadow fleet. The discovery sent shockwaves through every intelligence agency on the continent. The world had seen cyber attacks, disinformation campaigns, and covert assassinations from Moscow's playbook. But this was something else. It was hybrid warfare perfected, war without uniforms, aggression without fingerprints. Putin's strategists had named it *gray warfare. The art of controlling chaos without owning it. Every drone strike launched from a disguised tanker could be denied. Every act of sabotage could be hidden behind a fog of confusion. We didn't do it, they could say, and the world had no proof to argue otherwise. But Copenhagen changed that balance forever. Within hours, NATO's intelligence network lit up like a storm. Satellite feeds, naval radar, and electronic intercepts began hunting for patterns, the same kind of tankers, the same fake companies, the same routes. They found hundreds, more than 600 old rusting vessels operating under different flags but tied through a maze of offshore paperwork to Moscow's shadow empire. And then came the realization that shook the alliance. These ships weren't just evading sanctions. They were part of a coordinated military network designed to strike, disrupt, and terrify, all under the disguise of trade. Western governments scrambled to respond. Diplomats met behind locked doors, intelligence briefings stretched through the night, and naval task forces were quietly repositioned. But for every action, the Kremlin had already prepared its denial. No evidence, no admission, no responsibility. It was the perfect war until the ghosts were caught. The operation that followed was swift and quiet. In late September, French special forces stormed a tanker in international waters off Denmark's coast. They found exactly what the reports had warned of: hidden modules, modified containers, and components for launching drones. Inside the ship's navigation systems were encrypted coordinates that matched the path of the Copenhagen attack. For the first time, the proof was undeniable. The gray zone had turned black. The revelation ignited fury across Europe. What had seemed like isolated chaos was now seen for what it truly was: an orchestrated campaign of terror at sea. The Baltic, once a trade artery, had become a battlefield of deception, and every tanker flying a foreign flag was now suspect. Markets trembled again. Insurance companies declared emergency risk levels. Every major port authority from Rotterdam to Stockholm issued new restrictions, turning Russia's lifeline into a labyrinth of inspections and fear. The Shadow Fleet, once untouchable, had become radioactive. Meanwhile, in Moscow, panic hid behind arrogance. Officials spoke of Western lies, but the truth was spreading faster than propaganda. The empire's own creation had turned into its curse. The very fleet built to cheat sanctions now drew global condemnation. Every ship that once made Moscow richer now threatened to drag it deeper into isolation. The West called it times the Baltic Reckoning, asterisk. Inside the Kremlin they called it something else, times the exposure, asterisk. Because once the illusion was shattered, no amount of denial could rebuild it. In the offices of Volkov Energy, the news hit like a guillotine. Executives who once bragged about their unregistered fleet now hid their faces from the press. Captains received coded orders to shut down transponders, to disappear, to drift until told otherwise. The proud empire of shadows had turned into a fleet of fugitives. The fall of the Phantom Fleet was not just a military failure. It was the unraveling of an identity, the collapse of a strategy built on deceit. For years, the Kremlin believed that invisibility meant invincibility. But now the world could see everything. The ghosts had names, the ghosts had roots, the ghosts had masters. And with that, Russia's quiet war had been dragged into the light. It began with a soundless strike, not the crash of bombs, but the click times of a pen signing new laws. No soldiers marched, no fleets clashed, no missiles lit the sky. Yet, within hours, entire empires of trade collapsed. The West had unveiled a weapon sharper than any blade. Asterisk, asterisk, paper, asterisk, asterisk. Sanctions, contracts, and laws written with surgical precision became the modern artillery of power. They didn't need tanks, they had insurance. They didn't need warships, they had rules. The battlefield was no longer made of soil and blood, it was made of ledgers and signatures. The core of this invisible offensive was a network few had ever heard of, the asterisk asterisk London-based international group of P&I clubs, asterisk asterisk. These weren't armies, they were the quiet architects of global shipping. They insured almost every large vessel in the world, protecting them from accidents, spills, and disasters. No ship carrying millions of barrels of crude oil could move without their blessing. And in October 2025, that blessing was withdrawn. The new Western sanctions declared that any ship suspected of carrying Russian oil above the G7 price cap would be denied protection. The language was clinical, but its meaning was catastrophic. Overnight, hundreds of Russian tankers lost the legal right to exist on the open sea. Without insurance, they couldn't enter ports, pass through straits, or even refuel. Every voyage became a gamble, one accident away from bankruptcy. Putin's solution was desperate: create fake insurance companies at home, backed by the Kremlin's coffers. They issued glossy certificates and stamped documents with official-looking seals. But the world wasn't fooled. No serious port authority, no global refinery, no major trader dared to accept them. To do so meant risking exclusion from the dollar-based system, a death sentence in global commerce. And so, the blockade formed. No warships patrolled the Baltic, no missiles guarded the harbors, yet every Russian tanker that tried to leave its port hit an invisible wall, a wall of bureaucracy, risk, and fear. The same global system that once welcomed Russia's oil had now turned its back. Every port in Europe, every shipping channel, every refueling station carried the same unspoken message: asterisk, you are no longer welcome, asterisk. One ship became the symbol of this strangulation, asterisk, asterisk, the Furia, asterisk, asterisk. She was loaded with 730,000 barrels of Russian crude, bound for India's Sikka port. The deal had been signed, the route planned. The buyers, Reliance Industries and Bharat Petroleum, had prepared for arrival. But halfway through the Baltic Sea, the Furia's transponder blinked, hesitated, then stopped. She drifted. Satellite data showed her changing course, slowing, then halting entirely. Her insurance had been voided. Her passage through the Danish Straits was denied. Her Indian buyers, facing Western scrutiny, announced they would comply with sanctions and refused to receive the cargo. And so the Furia, a vessel filled with wealth, became worthless. She wasn't alone. Around her floated dozens of others, each carrying hundreds of thousands of barrels of oil that could not be sold, delivered, or even unloaded. Together, they formed a graveyard of ambition, the living proof of an empire trapped by paper. Behind the scenes, the effect of these invisible weapons spread like frost. Western governments added asterisk, asterisk, secondary sanctions, asterisk, asterisk, the cruelest layer yet. Now it wasn't just ships being punished, it was anyone who dared to help them. A port authority that allowed a Russian tanker to dock, blacklisted. A refueling company that provided fuel, cut off from the dollar system. A repair service that fixed a Russian vessel, expelled from international banking networks. Even far away in Asia, fear took root. Chinese and Indian firms, once eager to buy discounted Russian crude, began to retreat. The risk was too high. The financial system itself had become a weapon, and it did not miss. The once mighty asterisk, asterisk, shadow fleet, asterisk, asterisk, a network of over 600 tankers that had thrived on loopholes, now became a radioactive burden. No one wanted to touch them. They could not be insured, repaired, or serviced. They could not unload. They could not sail. They were ghosts in daylight, cursed to drift between laws and oceans, carrying cargo that no one dared to claim. Every executive in Moscow knew what this meant. The trap was closing. Russia's oil lifeline, its proudest economic artery, was suffocating not from a naval blockade, but from paperwork. The empire had been fenced in with ink, and yet the damage wasn't measured only in dollars, it was in humiliation. The Kremlin had always mocked Western power as fragile, bureaucratic, weak, but now that bureaucracy had turned into iron. The rules of global finance, once taken for granted, had become Russia's prison bars. In the command rooms of Volkov Energy, desperation turned into disbelief. Reports poured in, tankers stopped, contracts cancelled, storage tanks overflowing, and with every passing hour, the pressure grew. It wasn't a war fought with missiles, it was a war fought with signatures. And this time, Moscow was the one surrounded. It didn't take an army to break Russia's will, only a hum that came from the sky. The first drone didn't explode over a battlefield. It didn't strike a tank, a radar tower, or a military base. It flew low, unseen, and hit something far more valuable: time, certainty, asterisk. From that moment on, the fear of the next one became the weapon. Ukraine had discovered the empire's weakness, and it wasn't armor or missiles, it was pride. The war that Russia had started with noise and fury was now being answered with precision and patience. For every billion-dollar ship that floated helplessly in the Baltic, Kyiv had found a way to make it feel vulnerable, using drones that cost less than a car. Each of those unmanned machines carried more than explosives, they carried symbolism. They said to the world, asterisk, your power means nothing if you can't protect it. Asterisk, intelligence reports called them low-intensity operations. But to the men who watched their radars flicker with unidentified objects near the ports of St. Petersburg, Primorsk, and Ust-Luga, it felt like a nightmare that never ended. Every echo on their screens might be a bird, or it might be death. The attacks didn't happen every night. They didn't need to. The genius of Ukraine's strategy was not in frequency, but in fear. Every launch created a shadow that lingered for weeks. Every explosion, real or rumored, became a psychological blockade. Insurance companies called it asterisk, unquantifiable risk. Asterisk. No underwriter wanted to take responsibility for a port under threat. No captain wanted to sail into waters where invisible machines hunted from above. The result was paralysis. The Gulf of Finland turned into a graveyard of hesitation. Dozens of Russian tankers anchored offshore, unable to move forward yet afraid to turn back. They were like stranded predators, mighty but useless, surrounded by a prey they couldn't touch. Each one carried 500,000 barrels of oil and the unbearable weight of uncertainty, and the fear wasn't confined to the Baltic. The shockwaves spread through the entire machinery of global trade. European companies began rewriting safety protocols. NATO navies shifted patrols closer to key shipping lanes. Satellite surveillance over the Baltic increased threefold. The entire region turned into a chessboard, one where Russia's king couldn't move. In Moscow, panic wore the mask of control. Briefings were filled with calm words, but every official knew the truth: Ukraine had done what no Western power could achieve. It had made Russia's most prized ports feel exposed, fragile, and human. Behind closed doors, frustration erupted. Generals demanded retaliation, but against what? There were no bases to bomb, no fleets to strike, no targets to aim at. The drones came from nowhere and vanished into nothing. The Kremlin's Grand Navy, built to fight nations, was helpless against devices small enough to fit in a truck bed. Ukraine had found a new kind of warfare, one that didn't just destroy ships, but destroyed confidence. The old rules no longer applied. A single drone could stop an entire fleet, not through destruction, but through doubt. Even one attempted strike was enough to halt operations for days. When reports surfaced that a refinery in St. Petersburg had been hit, the effect rippled instantly. Traders paused transactions, shipping companies suspended routes, and the already fragile supply chain fractured further. The Baltic, once a symbol of Russia's dominance, had become its most vulnerable nerve, and as fear gripped the ports, the invisible blockade tightened. Insurance companies, still reeling from previous losses, began to classify the entire region as a war risk zone. Tankers without coverage couldn't move, ports couldn't load. Pipelines had to slow their flow to prevent overflow. The impact was staggering. What Ukraine had achieved with a handful of drones was something that decades of sanctions had failed to do. Asterisk, asterisk. It stopped Russia's heart from beating. Asterisk, asterisk. Every decision Kyiv made was deliberate. Every strike chosen not for destruction, but for message. It wasn't about sinking ships, it was about sinking trust. The Kremlin could deny involvement in attacks, but it couldn't deny the outcome. The empire's greatest source of wealth had become a trap of its own making. For years, Russia had hidden behind grey tactics, cyber warfare, propaganda, mercenary forces. But Ukraine had turned the playbook back on its creator. It used the same ambiguity, the same deniability, to corner its enemy. The message was clear. Asterisk. If your ports can't protect themselves, your oil can't reach the world. Asterisk. And the effect was paralyzing. Each new incident added to the legend stories of drones that came out of nowhere, of ships that caught fire without warning, of tankers that drifted unmanned for days. Whether true or exaggerated didn't matter. What mattered was belief. Ukraine had weaponized uncertainty, and belief was its ammunition. By the end of the month, the Baltic Sea had turned from an artery of wealth into a cage of fear. The ships that once symbolized Russia's control now floated like monuments to its vulnerability. Every captain staring at the radar knew that even if no drones appeared, they could, and that was enough to stop him. No navy surrounded Russia's coast. No army blocked its ports. The blockade existed only in the minds of those trapped within it, and that made it the most powerful blockade of all. Russia's empire didn't fall in a blast, it suffocated. The stillness began at the ports, but it spread like a pulse fading through the veins of an old, exhausted giant. The tankers anchored off the Baltic were only the surface of the wound. Beneath them, the entire industrial rhythm that had kept the country alive was coming undone. Volkov Energy's command network went dark first. Orders stopped making sense. Schedules collapsed into confusion. The once perfect choreography of Russia's oil machine extraction, transport, export broke down step by step. When the ports stopped loading, the storage tanks filled. When the tanks filled, the pipelines were forced to slow. And when the pipelines slowed, the refineries hundreds of miles inland began to choke on their own output. The system that had once seemed infinite revealed itself to be fragile, a single, breathless loop. One part failed, and the rest followed. At Primorsk, engineers sent their final report, asterisk, all reserves at capacity, asterisk. That single line rippled upward through the chain of command like a heartbeat stopping mid-beat. Every second that passed meant millions of dollars in crude oil trapped with nowhere to go. Every minute meant lost production, lost wages, lost leverage. The empire's strongest artery had turned against itself. Panic surged through the energy ministry in Moscow. Advisors whispered to the Kremlin that this was temporary, that logistics would recover, that ships would move again. But each day the stillness grew heavier, the pressure greater. When tank farms reached 100%, valves were shut, pipelines sealed, and refineries forced to cut their output in half. Then the second wave of failure began, the financial one. Without oil leaving the ports, the cash flow that sustained the Russian budget vanished. The war chest that financed soldiers, missiles, propaganda, and power began to drain faster than anyone imagined. Each stranded tanker represented a hole in the treasury. Billions locked inside steel hulls drifting aimlessly. The accountants called it delayed revenue. The truth was simpler. Asterisk, asterisk. The money was gone. Asterisk, asterisk. Inside Volkov Energy, workers whispered that they were being paid in promises. Contracts froze. Salaries arrived late, or not at all. The oligarchs who had built empires on oil profits started liquidating assets, desperate to cover their losses. Some fled to the Emirates, some to Cyprus, some simply disappeared. What was once a symbol of wealth had turned into a tomb of debt. And for the first time, the Russian elite felt what ordinary citizens had known for years, the weight of uncertainty. The Kremlin called for calm. Officials spoke in confident tones on state television, insisting that alternative routes were being arranged through Asia. But behind closed doors, the situation was chaos. The routes didn't exist. China hesitated, India stalled, and every port that once opened its gates to Russian oil now demanded impossible guarantees. The empire's greatest export had become untouchable. In the midst of this paralysis, the numbers turned catastrophic. Energy revenues, once nearly half of the federal budget, evaporated overnight. Every barrel that failed to move was another cut to the nation's war economy. The machines at refineries ran below capacity. Pipelines carried nothing but pressure, and tankers floated as monuments to a country choking on its own product. But the most devastating loss wasn't measured in oil or rubles, it was in image. For years, the Kremlin had built its strength on the myth of control. Russia, the energy superpower, the nation that could freeze or fuel continents at will. That myth was now collapsing in real time. The sight of motionless ships became a broadcast of weakness. The world no longer saw a power to be feared. It saw a regime paralyzed by its own machinery. In boardrooms and bunkers, generals and executives began turning on one another. Accusations flew: incompetence, sabotage, betrayal. No one wanted to take responsibility for the stillness spreading across the empire. No one dared to admit what everyone already knew. The blockade wasn't just outside, it was within. And still, the ships waited. Their engines rusted, their crews unpaid, their cargo unsellable. Each vessel burned fuel to power its systems, draining resources for no purpose other than survival. Billions of dollars in steel floating on the water, producing nothing but shame. Volkov Energy's grand empire, once the pride of Russian industry, had become a graveyard of assets. The company's network that once symbolized strength now stood as proof that no empire, no matter how powerful, could survive without motion. In a matter of weeks, what had been the beating heart of the Russian economy turned into its cage. The oil that once sustained the war had become the weight dragging it under, and as the Kremlin watched the numbers fall and the ships remain unmoved, one truth became undeniable. Asterisk, asterisk, the system was collapsing from the inside out. Asterisk, asterisk, the empire's mask cracked the moment its buyers stopped answering the phone. From New Delhi to Beijing, the calls that once ended in deals now ended in excuses. India's trade ministers spoke in polite tones, but their message was ruthless. Deliveries had failed, confidence had shattered. China, ever cautious, spoke less but moved faster, rerouting its contracts toward the Middle East. Within weeks, the very nations that had kept Russia's oil flowing turned away in quiet calculation. For years, Moscow had painted itself as the reliable giant of the East, the partner that never faltered, while the West stumbled over politics. That image now lay in ruins. The paralysis in the Baltic wasn't just a logistical failure, it was a betrayal of trust on a global stage. Those stranded tankers weren't just ships, they were broken promises floating under the Russian flag. Inside the Kremlin, the news hit harder than any sanction. The empire had built its foreign power on the illusion of certainty, on the idea that no matter what war it fought or rule it broke, the oil would always move. Now, the oil sat trapped, unsellable, untouchable. The message was clear: Russia could not even deliver to its own allies. In Beijing, officials demanded answers. Where was the oil they had already paid for? Where were the tankers promised weeks ago? The same questions echoed in Mumbai and Shanghai. The empire that once dictated prices was now reduced to sending apologies. Every conversation between Moscow and its buyers ended the same way: long pauses, then quiet disbelief. Putin's negotiators offered discounts so steep they bordered on desperation. They promised new routes, faster deliveries, secret corridors through friendly waters, but the buyers had already moved on. In the world of energy, reliability is worth more than loyalty, and Moscow had lost both. For the first time, Russia's empire of oil faced not rebellion but indifference. That was worse. India didn't need to denounce Moscow, it simply stopped returning calls. China didn't need to threaten sanctions, it quietly replaced Russian barrels with Saudi and Emirati ones. The corridors once filled with chatter and confidence now echoed with unanswered lines. This wasn't the punishment of enemies, it was the abandonment of partners. The Kremlin's great pitch to the world, asterisk, "We are the steady hand in an unstable age," asterisk had dissolved into a whisper no one cared to hear. And while Moscow scrambled to mend ties, its reputation eroded further. Western analysts didn't need propaganda, they needed only patience. The image of stranded tankers spoke louder than any speech. The world saw a superpower unable to move its own cargo, and that vision spread faster than news. The economic damage was immediate. Every cancelled deal was a lost lifeline. Every rerouted shipment tightened the noose around Russia's finances. Oil that should have been profit now sat rotting in storage, depreciating by the day. Inside Russia's Ministry of Finance, the reports arrived hourly, and each one bled more red ink. But the worst wound was pride. Putin's carefully built persona, the man who defied the West, who promised stability to the global South, was collapsing in real time. His speeches about resilience sounded hollow when even his allies couldn't get their oil. The empire that prided itself on strength now looked fragile, desperate, and old. At diplomatic receptions once dominated by Russian confidence, whispers replaced applause. Ambassadors from friendly nations exchanged cautious glances. The man who had once been courted as the architect of a new world order was now treated like a liability. The energy chessboard that Moscow had long believed it controlled had flipped. The kings had become pawns. The allies who once depended on Russian oil were building alliances elsewhere. Every move Moscow made to regain trust only revealed how little leverage it had left. And yet, inside Russia's state media, the illusion continued. Anchors spoke of temporary disruptions, of technical adjustments, of Western sabotage. But beyond the screens, the truth was plain. The empire's most loyal partners were gone, its most valuable resource was stranded, and its once feared reputation was collapsing into quiet ridicule. Across Asia, traders spoke of Russia not with respect, but with caution. Contracts were rewritten, deals postponed, ports closed. The flow of commerce had found new routes that no longer passed through St. Petersburg. In the global marketplace, reputation is currency, and Russia's had been spent. The phone lines that once hummed with opportunity now carried nothing but quiet. And in that quiet, the world heard something that Moscow had never wanted to reveal. Asterisk, asterisk, the sound of its isolation. Asterisk, asterisk. The empire began to crumble not at its borders, but in its heartbeat. Money was vanishing faster than promises could replace it. The once limitless reserves of the Kremlin had become a shallow pool. Every day that the ships remained trapped off-street, Petersburg meant another billion lost. The same tankers that once carried wealth to the world were now rusting mirrors, reflecting the failure of an entire system. Inside the Ministry of Finance, the question no one dared to ask began to echo. Asterisk. How do we survive without movement? Asterisk. The first answer was printed money. The presses roared to life, flooding the nation with rubles whose worth faded by the hour. The more they printed, the faster value evaporated. Inflation crept into every market, every household. Prices changed between sunrise and sunset. Workers received paychecks that bought half of what they had yesterday. The currency of a superpower was now as fragile as the faith of its people. The second answer was taxation. New decrees rolled out daily emergency levies, war contributions, increased tariffs. The burden fell on the people who had already borne too much. Business owners were ordered to support the national effort. Farmers were told to tighten belts for the homeland. The message was loyalty, the feeling was betrayal. The social contract that had bound Russia for 25 years began to tear. The unspoken deal, obedience in exchange for stability, no longer made sense when there was no stability left to give. The people who had once endured in quiet endurance now looked at their leaders with disbelief. Gas prices soared, shelves emptied, and the myth that Russia could weather any storm cracked open for all to see. Reports arrived from across the country. Fuel shortages in Siberia, rationing in the cities, fields left unplowed for lack of diesel. The empire built on energy could no longer power itself. Farmers burned through their reserves trying to keep tractors running. Truck drivers slept in long lines at empty gas stations. Even soldiers' families began to feel the weight of scarcity: cold apartments, unpaid wages, no light at night. This was no longer an economic problem, it was a collapse of spirit. The Kremlin tried to control the narrative. Officials went on television speaking of temporary disruption, of foreign sabotage. But even propaganda couldn't fill an empty tank or feed an empty stomach. The people had stopped believing. They didn't need foreign news to tell them the truth. They could see it every time they opened their wallets. For the first time, protests began not with anger but with exhaustion. Not shouts, but murmurs. Not revolution, but realization. Across the vast expanse of Russia, millions felt the same quiet thought that the empire no longer served them, that its wars had taken everything and given nothing. And in that quiet, something began to change. The soldiers at the front heard stories from home that their wives couldn't afford bread, that their children waited hours for fuel. The morale that once burned with pride began to fade into something colder. A soldier who fights for survival fights differently from one who fights for belief. The empire had not just lost its wealth, it was losing its purpose. Back in St. Petersburg, the tankers still waited. 30 great vessels, each a floating monument to arrogance. Their hulls carried more than oil, they carried the memory of a nation's obsession with control. What once symbolized power had become a confession of weakness. The ships stood still, their engines quiet, their crews forgotten. To the outside world, it was a geopolitical event. To the people living through it, it was the slow unraveling of everything familiar. The empire had turned inward, fighting itself. As the ruble's value sank and the protests grew louder, the illusion of invincibility disappeared. The Kremlin, once so sure of its destiny, now operated on fear. Fear of rebellion, fear of exposure, fear of its own reflection. And in that reflection, the truth was impossible to ignore. Russia's strength had never come from its oil, its weapons, or its wealth. It had come from its people, the same people now left in despair. The Baltic Trap was no longer a geopolitical term, it was a human one. It was the story of how pride blinded an empire, how power consumed itself, how a nation that once promised greatness found itself gasping for air under the weight of its own ambition. The ships remained anchored, rusting into the future. The ports stayed quiet. The empire that once believed it could conquer the world now fought a war against hunger, poverty, and disbelief, battles it could not win with guns. And so it ended, not with fire, but with stillness, not with surrender, but with exhaustion. The beast that had roared for decades had grown tired. The energy superpower that once boasted it could freeze Europe now shivered before its own cold. In the end, the sound that lingered was not war, nor protest, nor collapse, but the heavy quiet of realization, a quiet that stretched from the halls of power to the smallest homes, a quiet that asked a question history would not easily forget. What remains of an empire when even its heartbeat has stopped? History has a strange way of whispering truth, not through victories, but through consequences. The Baltic Trap was never just about oil or war. It was a mirror held up to power itself. It showed how pride, when left unchecked, corrodes from within. It showed how a nation that forgets compassion in pursuit of dominance eventually finds itself surrounded, not by enemies, but by its own mistakes. Every empire believes it can outlast time, yet time is the only empire that never falls. Wealth fades, fleets rust, leaders vanish, but what remains are the echoes of their choices. The true measure of greatness is not how loud a nation roars, but how wisely it listens to the world around it. If this story teaches anything, it's that control is an illusion, and humanity is the only resource that never depletes. The stronger a hand grips power, the more it loses touch with the people it was meant to protect. And in the end, every empire faces the same reckoning, not from others, but from within. Dear audience, as you reflect on this journey, remember, every action, every ambition, every war for dominance writes its price in human lives. The question isn't who wins or loses. The question is, what do we become in the process? If this story moved you, share it. Let it travel further than any border. Because somewhere out there, someone still believes that power makes them untouchable, and they need to hear this before it's too late.